All right, everyone, so now we're going to be looking at the Alabama return for basic volunteers. So after completing this section, you guys are just going to be able to determine if a taxpayer is eligible to claim a personal exemption on the Alabama return, and then assess whether a person qualifies as a dependent on the Alabama return. And then you'll be able to choose the most advantageous and allowable filing status for taxpayers, and then differentiate and explain key differences between the taxability of various income types on the federal return and the Alabama return. Okay, so this first little chart right here is just who must file. So these are the filing thresholds for certain family situations in the state of Alabama. And you'll notice that these filing thresholds are a lot lower than the federal thresholds. And so that threshold is a lot lower. And so a lot of times people will not be required to file a federal return, but they might be required to file an Alabama return. All right, so going on to personal exemptions. So the personal exemption amount in Alabama is actually based on filing status. For single and married filing separately taxpayers, it's $1,500. And for head of family and married filing jointly, it's $3,000. And these numbers do change from year to year just a little bit. And then for dependents, taxpayers receive a personal exemption in Alabama, even if they can be claimed as a dependent by someone else. So you'll remember from the federal training that if you can be claimed as a dependent, by your parents or things like that, you can't claim a personal exemption, but that's not the case in Alabama. Basically, in Alabama, everyone gets a personal exemption. It doesn't matter if you're being claimed or not. All right, and so what is the definition of a dependent in Alabama? This is an individual other than the taxpayer and their spouse who receives over 50% of their support from the taxpayer during the tax year and is related to the taxpayer in a certain type of way. All right, so the first test in determining dependency exemption for Alabama residents is the relationship test. And so this question asks, was the person your son, daughter, legally adopted child, stepson or daughter, or grandchild, or brother, sister, stepbrother or sister, or mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, stepmother or father, or mother-in-law, father-in-law, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, son-in-law, or daughter-in-law? If yes, go on to step 4. If no, go on to step 2. So say that one of the individuals did not meet one of these relationships, we would go to step 2. And then this is saying, okay, well, was the person your uncle, aunt, nephew, or niece? If yes, you would go to step 3. If no, they are not a dependent. Step 3 is asking, okay, those people in step 2, were they related to you by blood? If yes, you would go on to step 4. If no, they're not a dependent. So basically what this is saying is that those uncles, aunts, nieces, and nephews have to be related to you by blood in order to move on in the chart to see if they can be your dependent. Then the next question says, did you provide more than half of the person's total support for the year? If yes, you can claim them as a dependent, and if no, you cannot claim them as a dependent. All right, so most federal dependents are going to also qualify as Alabama dependents, but the following do not. So foster children, friends, and cousins are 3 examples of things that do qualify on the federal return, but will never qualify on the Alabama return. All right, so unlike the federal filing statuses, there are only 4 for the state of Alabama. They're single, married filing jointly, married filing separately, and head of family. So just some key differences. So single, married filing separately, and married filing jointly, they're all basically the same as the federal counterpart. Qualifying widow or widower with dependent child is not a filing status on the Alabama return, but these taxpayers are instead going to be classified as head of family. Head of family is similar to head of household, but there are a couple of key differences that we're going to talk about. So in order to qualify for head of family, all of the following must apply. The taxpayer has to be unmarried or legally separated as of the end of the year, and they need to pay more than half the cost of keeping up their home. So on the federal return, remember, there are some exceptions where if you did not live with your spouse for the last 6 months of the year and you have a dependent that meets certain relationships, then you can claim head of household. But that's not the case in Alabama. You do have to be unmarried or legally separated in order to be head of family. And then also you have to have a qualifying person that lived with you in your home for more than half the year. All right, so who are these qualifying persons that qualify the taxpayer to be head of household? So this is similar to head of household qualifying persons on the federal return. If the qualifying dependent is the taxpayer's mother or father, that person qualifies them to be head of family whether or not they live in the taxpayer's home. And then the mother or father qualifies them to be head of family whether or not the taxpayer claims them as a dependent. And then similar to head of household, so if you have a qualifying dependent that is the taxpayer's child, grandchild, great-grandchild, adopted child, or stepchild. So this first little note right here, these individuals are qualifying persons regardless of whether the taxpayer claims them as a dependent, and this is for single dependents. And then if you have a married dependent, they're going to qualify you to be head of household only if the taxpayer does claim them as a dependent. If you have other qualifying dependents like brother, sister, aunt, niece, etc., that person is going to qualify you to be head of household regardless of whether or not you claim them as dependents. All right. So all income is subject to Alabama income tax unless it's specifically exempted by Alabama state law. So all federal income is going to be taxable to the state unless it's specifically exempted. So some types of income that are specifically exempted from income tax on the Alabama return are unemployment compensation and Social Security benefits. All right, so now we're just going to briefly talk about the standard deduction. So the standard deduction is based on a range for the filing status, and basically this range is a lot lower than the federal standard deduction. And the reason that this is important is because taxpayers may not have had enough expenses to itemize on the federal return, but they might have enough expenses to itemize on the state return. And so we always want to put in those itemized deductions. And remember, itemized deductions are out of scope for basic volunteers. And so if the taxpayer has any of these expenses, the campus fellow or site coordinator will need to enter them. So there are a couple of questions that the Alabama return asks in TaxSlayer. So it'll ask, did the taxpayer file an Alabama return during the previous year? Who is the taxpayer's current employer? And does the taxpayer have any income that's listed on their federal return that is not listed on their state return? And so you'll need to answer those questions in TaxSlayer in order to complete the Alabama return. So for the first question, did the taxpayer file an Alabama return in the previous tax year? You're going to answer yes or no, and if the answer is no, you're just going to provide a brief explanation. So if they neglected to file, you would just write that. If they didn't live in Alabama and therefore weren't required, you would just say, they lived in a different state, or maybe they weren't required to file, so their income was too low. The next question, who is the taxpayer's current employer? So the Alabama return is going to ask for the employer's information, the address, the city, the zip code, all that stuff. If they have multiple employers, you're just going to select the W-2 with a higher amount of wages. This question, so it'll ask, does the taxpayer have any income listed on the federal return that's not reported on the state return? So remember, this is going to be the unemployment compensation, the Social Security benefits, and any retirement that's not taxable to the state. And remember, all retirement is going to be out of scope for basic volunteers. Advanced volunteers are going to only be able to enter that information in. And just like defined benefits retirement, railroad retirement is another type of retirement that is specifically exempted from state income tax. All right, so just like the federal return, if a taxpayer gets a refund or owes an amount, they can opt to receive a direct deposit, or they can direct debit the amount owed out of their bank account. And the other option, of course, is to receive a check in the mail or to send in a check to the Department of Revenue. All right, so at this point, you'll just complete the Alabama section of the Beth Branch tax return, and you can look at the Beth Branch walkthrough videos that are available on our YouTube channel as well. And that's going to conclude the Alabama return section of the basic training.